Hey everybody, I'm Elizabeth, Kat's sister. Today, I'll be going into more detail about how I make fake wood out of insulation foam. I use this method to make the wooden walls, roof, and boards that go across the door for the swamp facade. If you have no idea what I'm talking about, check out the video linked in the description below. So let's get to it. First, you're going to need some foam. This insulation foam, also known as extruded polystyrene or XPS foam, is super versatile and can be used to make fake wood, stone, or pretty much anything. Here, I'm using foam that's 1 inch thick. I've marked my planks to be 4 inches wide and about 30 inches long. If you're making wooden wall panels for a structure, I would suggest using forced perspective. On the walls of the swamp facade, I marked the bottom boards to be 4 inches wide, then gradually decreased the width of each board as I went up. This helps make the facade appear taller than it actually is. Once you have your boards marked, you'll want to start heating up your carving tool. I use the Walnut Hollow Creative Versatool to carve and cut my boards. It's a really great tool, it's pretty cheap, about 20 bucks, and you can find it online or in various craft stores. In this tutorial, I'm going to be using the knife attachment and the chisel attachment, and I'll set the temperature right in the middle. You're going to need a respirator and goggles when melting this foam. I also highly recommend leather gloves when working with any sort of hot tool. Accidents happen, and getting your thumb slit open by a 500-degree knife is not a fun experience, believe me. First, you're going to cut out your boards with the knife attachment. Skip this step if you're making a wooden wall panel, you'll only need the chisel attachment. Don't worry if your cuts are kinda messy, we'll clean them up later. Now that all of your boards are cut out, you'll want to switch to the chisel attachment. First, unplug your hot tool. Then use pliers, not your hands, to remove the knife attachment and replace it with the chisel. Now you'll want to give your wood some character by adding weathered and cracked ends to your boards. I position the tool and board so that I just bring the chisel straight down from the top, or straight across the side if you're working on a wall panel. Bring it down anywhere from 2 to 8 inches. Like a pen bleeding ink, the longer the tool sits in one spot, the more foam it will melt, so vary up the speed at which you drag the tool to create knots and larger or smaller cracks. You also don't have to start at the edge of your board every time. I like to imagine the wood splitting at multiple places along the middle of the board too. The most important thing is to visualize the grain of your wood. Real wood will mostly weather and crack along its grain. If the grain runs horizontally, then you'll want your cracks to run horizontally too. If you're making wooden wall panels, this is when you should carve the groove between your boards. Use the chisel attachment, but do not go all the way through. When I made the swamp facade, I attached a board of Polyisocyanurate Foam behind every panel of XPS Foam. This gave the foam more structure while keeping it lightweight. Do not carve into this foam with the hot tool. This is also when I will run the flat part of the chisel along the edge of the board to smooth out the areas I cut with the knife. Once you're happy with your weathering, you can start painting your boards. In my experience, I have found that it's best if you paint XPS foam with a latex paint first. Otherwise, the foam will just absorb whatever other paint you try to put on. I just use cheap latex house paint from Walmart. For wood, I use a darker latex paint, like black or dark brown, since this will show up as the darker pattern in the grain. So now we can add the grain. First, I spray the boards with water. This is a very important step because I find that it helps soften the look of your grain by letting the edges bleed a little bit. This makes the boards look more realistic. It can be a challenge to find the right amount of water. If you add too much, then your grain will lose its contrast and detail. If you add too little, then your grain may be too harsh and will look more artificial. I would suggest practicing on scrap material first. After spraying the board, take a roller and roll on a thin layer of your lighter color. Don't use too much paint because you don't want it going in the cracks you've carved. For the swamp facade, I used a grayish color. Here, I'm using lighter brown. Your final product will be darker than this, so don't worry if it looks a little light right now. This little tool, available in most home improvement stores, is called a wood graining tool. While the paint is still wet, drag the wood graining tool across the board in the direction of your grain. Rock the tool forwards and back to create knots and variations in the grain. I also wipe the excess paint off the tool after every time I drag it. If you don't like an area, you can go back over it with the tool again in the same direction before the paint dries. Go over your remaining boards. Remember to spray with water every time. You'll also notice that the water will help diffuse some of those paint-heavy bright spots. Once your paint dries, it will have a smoother look, like here on the wall of the swamp facade. You'll notice that the cracks remain dark while your wood grain sits on top. Once the wood grain was dry, I took black spray paint and painted along the edges. I also lightly went over the top of the board to darken it. Here you can see a spray painted board on the left and the unfinished boards on the right. If you're making standalone boards instead of wall panels, make sure that you cover any drips of the lighter paint on the sides of your boards. On the actual facade, I concentrated this black paint in corners and other shadowy areas. Artificially darkening shadows with paint will make your prop appear more intimidating. When spray painting insulation foam, you should be careful not to get the nozzle of the spray paint can too close to the foam you're spraying. I don't know why, but this will cause your foam to melt in this weird droplet manner. It could be a cool effect for something, but I'm not sure if this melting releases any hazardous chemicals, so just be careful. I sprayed my boards with water one more time, then lightly went over the middle part with a light brown spray paint. Water helps give the paint a little opacity. This step just gives the board a bit more variety in color, making it less flat. Lastly, I add a thin coat of dark reddish brown, concentrating it more around the shadows. These spray paint layers will help blend the wood grain by making the whole thing a little more dark brown, rather than light brown contrasted with black. If you're doing wall panels, you can add splashes of color by mixing water with acrylic paint in a spray bottle, then spraying that on and blending it with a rag or paintbrush. Don't be afraid of using more colors than just brown or black to create a unique look. For example, on the swamp facade I used grays, blues, browns, and purple. And here's the final product. I hope you guys enjoyed the tutorial. If you have any questions, leave them in the comments, and make sure you subscribe if you want to see more tutorials and other cool stuff.